Good morning. Well, I'm a huge fan of PBL Works, and I have heard so much about this event over the years and the rave reviews that it's always drawn. It may have something to do with the fact that it brings together passionate educators to learn from each other, to meet each other, to connect with each other in a place that encourages day drinking. My talk today with you focuses on three important concepts facing our schools and our students. The first relates to the pace of change in the world and how that is accelerating. Second, we'll talk about the importance of student experience. You've heard some of that this morning already, and how we build systems around that student experience. And finally, we'll touch on how our work impacts the future of our democratic republic and our world. I'd like to start by introducing you to my dearly departed maternal grandfather, Willis Wilson Howell. Willis Wilson went by the name Joe, and I've asked my mother the story behind how we went from Willis Wilson to Joe, and it's been lost to the sands of time. But we just called him Pa. Pa was a tobacco farmer, and he spent his life farming the red dirt in south central Kentucky. And I can remember riding on the tractor with him, and my hands being on top of his, and he had these larger than life hands that were calloused and worn and powerful. And he had these sunburned arms that with scratches on them, but I always felt like there were steel cables under his skin because he spent his life working in those fields. Pa actually grew up in Oklahoma, and there's some Oklahomans here, I heard. And he migrated east, yes, the opposite direction of what you normally hear, with his family as a child to Kentucky in a covered wagon. So that happened. And the wagon broke down somewhere in Arkansas, and it required a rescue expedition of some of our family members in Kentucky to go to Arkansas with more wagons and horses and rescue them and bring them back and relocate them to Kentucky. My grandfather started his career as a farmer the old-fashioned way, and he talked to us about plowing those fields behind a mule, walking back and forth across those fields. But by the end of his life, he was driving his Chevrolet pickup truck on an interstate highway system with air conditioning and AM/FM radio, no less. So just think about that for a minute. The progress and the change that he experienced in just one lifetime. These are my children, Nora and Chase, and everybody I think has got photos like this. This is they're 10 and 11 now, going on 18 and 19. But I can still remember when they were born, and I could hold their whole body in both my hands. And this photo is from when we lived in Eagle, Colorado. It was an amazing place. And this is a picture of when they saw their first snowstorm. And so my daughter here is 1 and my son is 6 months old. My son's the curious one of our two children, and he likes to ask me about what life was like back in the 1900s. And what we did with ourselves before the internet. So he just can't understand. How did you exist? My point is this: if you think about your own kids for a minute, or maybe some of the students that you work with, or perhaps a young person that's in your life, or maybe 3 or 4-year-olds that are in your preschools in your community. Think about how much the world is going to change in their lifetime. Remember, my grandfather went from the covered wagon and broken down in Arkansas to the interstate highway system in his Chevrolet pickup truck. But our kids today are likely going to have lifespans that go beyond 100 years. It's hard for us to even wrap our minds around how much the world is going to change. But as educators, that's what we do. We have to be futurists. We have to think about where the world is going and what are the skills, the knowledge, the competencies that our children will need for their future. And then how do we create the learning experiences that prepare them for that future? Whatever the future holds, it's a safe bet that it is going to be faster and more automated and more globally interconnected than it is right now. We're in an era of both predictable and unpredictable accelerations. Thomas Friedman wrote about these accelerations, and he likened it to being on a roller coaster. And accelerations, when you know that they're coming and you expect them, are fun and exciting. And accelerations, when you don't know that they're coming and you're not prepared for them, are terrifying, right? So that feeling of accelerations, if you don't have a queasy stomach, is something that you can look forward to and be excited about. So as educators, we also have to think about those accelerations and those changes and be futurists, to imagine what the world will be like and prepare our students for those accelerations so that they're prepared, so that they're ready. When it comes to preparing our students for that exciting future, planning for those accelerations, we have to, I think, simultaneously hold two concepts in our heads at once. And these concepts, I think, relate to many of the roles of the people that are in here. Just a show of hands, how many of you are practitioners and that you're working directly with students? A show of hands. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. And how many of you, show of hands, are system leaders? So you're a principal, you're a district leader, you're a superintendent, those folks, right? Great. So we've got classroom practitioners here, and we've got system leaders here. And we have to focus on both of those roles at the same time. We have to think about the micro level, the student experience. And when I say micro, please don't confuse that as meaning small or unimportant. The micro level is where it matters most. The changing the experience of the student and thinking about that individual's experience. If we don't change that, if we don't make that more meaningful, more relevant, change that experience in a way that prepares our students for their future, we haven't really done anything. So the work is at the micro level. At the same time, we've got system leaders here who work at the macro level. And at the macro level, we talk about terms like systems and process and policies and supports, all of which are necessary to bring about change. And these macro level efforts are also necessary and important if we're going to bring about changes at the micro level, the student experience level. But I'd like to go into these two sort of realms a little more deeply. So if you're working at the micro level, at the student experience level, present a framework for you to think about how we change the experience of students. And then also at the macro level, if you're working at that level, some things to think about. So at the micro level, John Hattie gives us a framework to talk about. And our efforts in Kentucky have focused on a concept that we've referred to as deeper learning for our students. And PBL Works has been a massive support to us in that regard. We've used part of our COVID relief dollars to focus on changing the experiences of our students statewide in Kentucky, because we want to not just recover from the pandemic. We want to make school better, profoundly better than it was before the pandemic. In Kentucky, we've avoided defining or coming out with some kind of state definition of what deeper learning is, because we believe that there's merit and it's important work to have our practitioners wrestle with what that means themselves, to debate it. All of us have experienced times in our lives where we've been involved in deep learning, either in school or in outside of school. And we've also experienced a lot of learning that wasn't deep. Hattie's framework can be helpful to us at the micro or student level in how we think about these three different levels. Hattie talks about surface, deep, and transfer learning. And he says all three of them are important, especially surface learning. He defines surface learning like this. Surface learning does not mean superficial learning. Rather, surface learning is a time when students are initially exposed to concepts, skills, and strategies. Surface learning is critical because it provides a foundation on which to build as students are asked to think more deeply. So we've heard education thinkers like E.D. Hirsch talk about the importance of this kind of learning. There's a large amount of content that students need to know to understand and interact with the world. And as educators, we have to think about how we can get that content to our students as quickly and as efficiently as possible. And education futurist Tony Wagner has also staked out the importance of what he called content learning as foundational. And we know the PBL Works gold standard starts with a focus on key knowledge. So surface learning is really important. So we don't jump over that. But it becomes a problem when that's all there is. So we need more. Hattie defines deep learning as a period when students consolidate their understanding and apply and extend some surface learning to knowledge to support deeper contextual understanding. We think of this as a sweet spot. We often take up more instructional time, but it can be accomplished only when students have the requisite knowledge to go deeper. Okay, so Hattie brings in some important concepts here as we go beyond surface learning. There is this aspect of consolidation, that we're bringing knowledge together. And there's this important aspect of application, which is critical to the work that PBL Works, is the application of knowledge, and an acknowledgement that this is going to take more time, and it builds on foundational surface knowledge that students have. But Hattie doesn't stop here. He goes on to talk about transfer learning, the point at which students take their consolidated knowledge and skills and apply what they know to new scenarios and different contexts. It's also a time when students are able to think, and I underscore this, metacognitively, reflecting on their own knowledge and understanding. If we're to have student learning that prepares them for that fast-moving, unknown, accelerating world ahead, this transfer learning has got to be the goal of what we do with our schools. And this is where the PBL Works gold standard model is so incredibly powerful, because it is a design lens that supports teachers and students in getting to the place of that transfer learning, and it emphasizes the importance of processing and reflection to make learning and the lessons stick. I've talked a lot here, and probably far faster than you thought a guy from Kentucky was possible. But I'd like to give you a couple of minutes to process with your neighbor about these concepts that Hattie gives us of surface, deep, and transfer. So just process for a minute some things that you're thinking about. I'll give you about 1 minute to do that. So I hope that framework of surface, deep, and transfer, if you're working at the micro level, if you're working as a practitioner directly with students, it gives you some things to think about as you construct and design learning. And again, the PBL Works gold standard is a great way to get at all of these. If you work your way through the central concepts or design elements and then the outside wheel that's on the PBL Works gold standard, you're going to get to these concepts. I want to now shift to those of you that are system leaders and are working at a school or a district capacity, or maybe even a state policy worker like me. Just to orient us, we focused on the micro level so far, trying to create a framework for how we think about the experience of the student. Where Hattie gives us 3 concepts at the micro level, this framework at the macro level comes from Harvard's Joel Mehta and a group of districts in the United States and Canada, and one state, Kentucky, involved, called the Deeper Learning Dozen. This group of school organizations is in very different contexts and sizes, and they've been working together for about the past 5 years to think about how we set up the conditions for deeper learning, which would include both Hattie's deep and transfer, to take root and thrive at the system level. The 3 big ideas at this macro level are emergence, symmetry, and equity, and we'll get into each of those. Emergence is a different way of thinking about the change process. That you might think about it's sort of the antidote to the top-down, policy-driven change that most of us have experienced in our professional lives. Instead, emergence holds that those things that need to change and how to go about changing them are already taking place at the small scale if you take the time to look for it. The work of the system leader in emergence is not to drive change, but it's instead to support, connect, and resource the change that is already taking place. So it's a very sort of organic and supportive approach to change. Emergence theorist Adrienne Marie Brown said that emergence is a strategy for building complex patterns and systems of change through relatively small interactions in an adaptive and relational way of being. Emphasizing the grassroots approach to this change, she says, small is good, small is all. The large is a reflection of the small. In Kentucky, you heard about some of our listening tour efforts. This was a direct way at the state level to try and get at this concept of emergence. We wanted to hear directly from Kentuckians. What were their aspirations? What were their hopes? What were things that were happening in the state that they were proud of, that they wanted to see grow? And then our work became connecting, resourcing, and supporting that. So in emergence, the role of the system leader, and so if you're a system leader here, the role of the system leader is much less to drive or force change. It is instead to support it and support change that's already taken root, to encourage it, to accelerate that. So a second concept at the system level is symmetry. This concept is something that Meta and the members of the Deeper Learning Dozen work a great deal on. You've experienced some of that here. This is a word that you've heard before, but it will take on a different context and meaning, perhaps. Symmetry here refers to the idea that quality learning experiences that we seek for our students and the quality learning experiences that we seek for our adults are fundamentally the same. There's a symmetrical relationship between those. And adult learning and student learning, they're not different and they build on each other. It also tells us that one of the challenges we have as system leaders in bringing about these deeper, more meaningful learning experiences for students is that we have limited learning experiences for the adults that are working with the students. We have adults who've experienced school at a mostly surface level. And too often our professional learning and adult learning experiences are similarly surface level experience. So in order for the adults in our system to be better able to support and create deep learning for our students, we have to intentionally create deep learning experiences for our adults so that they can facilitate and support those. So those of you here that are involved in creating professional learning for the adults in your systems, consider and think about, are you creating opportunities for your adults to engage in deeper learning and transfer learning in the same kinds of ways that you'd like to see those changes happening for your students? So the last element here at the macro level, and this is something that you heard talked about earlier as well, the value of PBL works. Our final macro level or system level concept is equity, and by this I mean that deeper learning and transfer learning experiences are good for every learner. And that especially is true when it comes to our historically underserved and marginalized students. As a system leader who spent years working on deeper learning in a number of different contexts, I can't tell you how many times I've heard some version of this phrase, "These kids aren't ready for that." Or they can't handle the kind of complexity that you're talking about. Or we just need to focus on the basics. If we deny Black, brown, poor kids and kids with disabilities access to the kinds of meaningful learning experiences that they need to be successful, then we as system leaders become complicit with the larger system that has denied opportunities for these children for generations. PBL Works a couple of years ago published a blog piece from John Larmer that summarized the powerful and provocative work of Martin Haberman, talking about the acts of teachers and what Haberman called the pedagogy of poverty. You see the teaching acts in the pedagogy of poverty listed here. So it's giving information, asking questions, giving directions, giving grades, marking papers, punishing noncompliance. You can read the list yourselves. If these are the kinds of tasks that teachers are engaged with, it's no wonder that what kind of commensurate low-level tasks and experience the students are engaging with. A commitment to equity means that these kinds of deep and rich learning experiences are good for for every child, especially so for those who've too often been provided surface and a test prep focused learning experience. So hopefully I've given you some things to think about if you're working at the micro level, so surface, deep, transfer, and those concepts, and at the macro level. This framework from the Deeper Learning Dozen gives you some things to think about here. So I'd like to again pause, give you a chance to process. Now you've got these two sort of frameworks, the micro level and the macro level, and just process out loud with someone near you about these two frameworks, the macro or the micro, whichever portion of it you want to talk about. So let's take 1 minute and do that. Well, my hope or my goal was really that if you're working as a practitioner or if you're working as a system leader, you've got some things to process through that you can hopefully take home and use to advance this work of deep learning in your communities. And of course, the micro and the macro level are constructs that I brought in, but really we know that these things have to work together. I'd like to close with focusing on something really important but very different for a moment. This past legislative session in Kentucky, the General Assembly passed Senate Bill 150, which I would characterize as one of the most bigoted, hateful, and shameful pieces of legislation targeting LGBTQI people and youth in the nation. At the Kentucky Department of Education, we have been steadfast in our opposition to this new law, calling it out for the dangerous and totalitarian policy that it is. We try to walk the talk when it comes to emergence at the Kentucky Department of Education. We have a large group of stakeholders that we meet with regularly around the state to advise us on the steps that we need to be taking as a state agency and how we can be more supportive of our communities and our schools. One of the things I'm most proud of about that effort is that we intentionally include students and we lift up the voices of our students. At one of our most recent meetings, we had an agenda focused on innovation and deeper learning and better assessments and new ways of thinking about accountability. These are all really exciting and important topics for the adults in the room, and they're important topics for us to be thinking about and working on at the system level. But at the meeting, one of the student members took the mic and he broke down. He said he didn't know how we could just act like what was happening wasn't happening. He had friends and family members who were LGBTQI, who were afraid and who were already being harassed and bullied by those who were emboldened by the legislation targeting this marginalized population. Young people have an incredible sense of justice and fairness and a willingness to say what needs to be said that we too often lose as we get older. I don't want to make the same mistake with you here now. We've got important work to do when it comes to creating meaningful learning experiences for our students, and that's why we're here. At the same time, I know that many of you may be working in states like Kentucky, where groups of your students are being targeted by similar legislation, or the teaching of certain concepts or history is being criminalized, or you're being directed to do things that you know as an education professional are wrong or that actually put your students at risk. This will be a moment of courage, but I wonder if you're working in one of those states or you're working in a place where you've experienced that or you know someone who has experienced what I'm talking about, if you could please stand up. So your colleagues that are standing in the room right now are living through this right now. And if you're not one of those people, God bless you and keep you. But this may be coming for you soon enough. We are living in a frightening time. We are seeing an erosion of the rights of women, efforts to erase people's experiences from history because it makes someone uncomfortable, and chilling us versus them statements about marginalized people. One Kentucky state representative has even called the LGBTQI community a disease. And here in a nation made up of people who immigrated here, either by force or by choice, unless you're a Native American, we've seen a steady pulse of hateful vitriol turn toward these people. I want you to know that what we're experiencing as a country right now is not normal, and it must not be normalized. This is not okay. This is not okay, and you should not accept it as okay. Appeasement has never worked with these kinds of regimes. It only invites them to go further and to do more. Much of this dangerous rhetoric and policy enacted harkens back to some mythologized view of the past, when things were supposedly great, or better than they are now. But those times in the past weren't great for everyone, especially if you didn't look like me. Another student said something else profound to me. She said, "It's a privilege for someone like you to study and learn about racism and oppression rather than to actually live it." And how's that for a truth bomb from a teenager? Right? You may be wondering what you can do in the face of all of this. Yale historian Tim Snyder is a writer that I admire very much. He spent his life studying 20th century totalitarian regimes. From this, he identified common patterns and themes that emerge as these movements take hold. He wrote a little book a few years ago called On Tyranny. It's short, it's only about 100 pages. You can probably pick it up at the airport bookstore, and you can read it on your flight home. Snyder lays out 20 lessons from his study on tyranny. Some of them relate to our experience as educators right now, so I'd like to list just a few of them with you. First, do not obey in advance. Too often, totalitarian regimes are shown what they can really do by people who just start acting in a way they believe the regime wants, without even being made to do so. So if you're self-censoring your curriculum, removing things that were perfectly appropriate 18 months ago, because now it's considered offensive, you are obeying in advance. Second, defend institutions. State agencies, school boards, school districts. Admittedly, some of these institutions are hard to love. But in places where they have been corrupted to carry out an ideological agenda of censorship and hate, even going as far as to target and punish educators who speak up against them, you really get a sense of what we stand to lose. So stand up for and defend your institutions, because they cannot defend themselves. Third, remember your professional ethics. If you're working in one of these states, like I am, you may be asked to do things that feel strange, feel unprofessional, or that actually put students at risk. Remember your professional ethics, and you may need the counsel of an attorney who represents your interests, or talk to your union and to support you in thinking through what is the right thing for you to do. An attorney representing your school district or your state, they may be competent, professional, wonderful people, but they do not necessarily have your interest at heart. So think about who their client is and who can advise you best. Fourth, stand out. I've said previously that appeasement does not work with these folks. It only emboldens them to go further. So show up, stand out, appear in person, and preferably in mass. Looking them in the eye is much more effective than anything that you can do online. And finally, this is hard. Be as brave as you can. These decisions are intensely personal, and you will need to think through what risks come with being a person who stands up. There are risks that come with that, and these regimes have proven they can be vindictive and retaliatory to those who oppose them. But we also have to consider that there is a real cost that comes when we're governed by our fear. Like many of you, I'm so proud to be an American, and I believe in this country's capacity for greatness. America was great when we ended the evil institution of slavery and the forced rape and the separation of children and families that came with it. We were great when we extended women the right to participate in our democracy and provided them access to economic independence. We were great when our nation stood up against fascism in other lands. We were great when we protected the rights of black people to vote and stood up against lynch mob justice and violence against them. And we were great when we recognized that love is love, regardless of what form it takes. Our country has been at its greatest when we lived up to our ideals as a nation and did the hard work of extending those values to include everyone. Thank you very much. It's been an honor to be with you.